1. A Desert That Remembers. More than half a century ago, a British director and two young actors walked into the Australian outback and came back with a film that has never stopped whispering its secrets. Walkabout is one of those rare works that millions admire and almost no one fully understands. It is screened in film schools, referenced in video essays, quoted by cinematographers who consider it sacred text, and yet the deepest choices buried inside its frames remain to this day hidden in plain sight. What if I told you that the most important scene in the film contains almost no dialogue, and that its true meaning was designed to be felt only on a second or third viewing? What if the performance that defines the movie was shaped not by rehearsal, but by a 16-year-old non-actor's instinct that the director couldn't have planned? Let's pull back the curtain on Walkabout, a film about survival, silence, and the fatal collision between two ways of seeing the world, and uncover the detail that changes how you see every frame. 2. A hidden layer. Here is the idea this film quietly proves and that most analyses still dance around. Walkabout is not a survival story. It is a study in failed translation, a tragedy about two cultures that come close enough to touch and still cannot read each other. Everything Nicolas Roeg builds, from the structure of the edit to the placement of a single insect on a branch, serves that thesis. And once you see it, the ending hits like a door closing forever. To unpack that, we need to look at four things most viewers never examine closely. First, the radical editing architecture Roeg imported from his work as a cinematographer, a method that makes the landscape itself a speaking character. Second, the real-world conditions that shaped performances no script could have dictated. Third, a single scene involving a ritual dance that contains the entire moral argument of the film in roughly 4 minutes. And fourth, the quiet, almost invisible way the movie comments on its own act of looking, an ethical self-awareness that was decades ahead of its time. Each of these layers has been partially discussed. None of them have been fully connected. That changes now. 3. The world before Walkabout. To understand what Roeg achieved, you have to understand what he was walking away from. By the late 1960s, British cinema was in a strange place, caught between the fading energy of the kitchen sink realists and the rising spectacle of the Bond franchise. Roeg had spent years as one of the finest cinematographers in the world, shooting far from the madding crowd for John Schlesinger and contributing breathtaking second-unit work in Lawrence of Arabia. He understood light and landscape the way a poet understands vowels. But he wanted to direct, and the industry was slow to let him cross that line. His first solo directing credit, Performance, co-directed with Donald Cammell, had been a volatile experience. Warner Brothers was appalled by the film's hallucinatory blend of sex, violence, and identity collapse. It sat on a shelf for 2 years before a reluctant release. Roeg emerged from that process bruised, restless, and hungry for total creative control. When Edward Bond's spare, almost skeletal screenplay adaptation of James Vance Marshall's novel landed in his hands, Roeg saw something that most directors would have missed. Not an adventure, but an elegy. The novel had been published in 1959 under the title The Children, a slim, almost fable-like story of two American children lost in the Australian desert and guided to safety by an Aboriginal boy on his walkabout. A months-long solo journey marking the transition to manhood. Bond stripped the adaptation to its bones. Roeg decided to strip it further. He would let the desert do the talking. And that decision, that instinct to trust silence over exposition, is where everything begins. 4. Persona Paradox. The casting of Walkabout is one of those moments where luck and vision become indistinguishable. Jenny Agutter, cast as the unnamed girl, was already a working actress at 16, polished enough to handle dialogue and blocking with professional ease. She carried herself with a composure that read, on camera, as something more complicated. A kind of English reserve that Roeg understood was not just a character trait, but a cultural armor. Agutter brought discipline to the role. What she also brought, perhaps without fully knowing it, was an unconscious embodiment of the very thing the film critiques: inability of the colonizer's gaze to truly see what is in front of it. Then there was David Gulpilil. He was 16 years old, a Yolngu man from Arnhem Land with no acting experience whatsoever. He was a ceremonial dancer of extraordinary skill, and that physicality, fluid, grounded, entirely present in his body, became the core of his performance. Roeg did not audition Gulpilil in any traditional sense. He watched him move. He watched the way Gulpilil related to the land, the way his attention shifted between sky and soil with an ease that no drama school could teach. And he knew. What most people don't realize is that the contrast between these two performers wasn't just thematic, it was methodological. Agutter worked from a script, from marks on the ground, from a director's notes. Gulpilil worked from presence. He responded to what was actually happening, the weather, the animals, the texture of the earth beneath his feet. Roeg, rather than smoothing out this difference, leaned into it. Let the friction between two entirely different modes of being on camera become the friction of the film itself. And beneath that creative electricity, there was a cost. Gulpilil, the experience of being extracted from his community, placed in front of a camera crew, and asked to perform versions of sacred cultural practices for a Western audience, carried a weight that would echo through the rest of his life. Persona the world would build around him, the natural, the discovery, the effortlessly charismatic indigenous performer, was always a simplification. And simplification, as the film itself argues, is where understanding goes to die. 5. The choice that changed everything. The single decision that most fundamentally shaped Walkabout happened before a frame of film was exposed, and it had nothing to do with casting. It was Roeg's choice to shoot the film himself. This was unusual. Directors who also serve as their own cinematographer sacrifice a layer of collaboration. They lose the second pair of eyes that can catch what the director, consumed by performance and pacing, might miss. But Roeg wasn't interested in that safety net. He wanted the camera to be an extension of his own nervous system. He wanted to see the desert the way a painter sees a canvas, not as a backdrop, but as the subject. The practical consequences were enormous. Roeg shot on location in the outback under conditions that ranged from brutal to surreal. Temperatures soared past 40 degrees Celsius. Water had to be trucked in. The crew was lean by necessity. There was no village of trailers, no craft services tent, no air-conditioned refuge. Roeg used this austerity. He shot quickly, often with natural light, and he built his visual vocabulary around the rhythms of the environment rather than the rhythms of a conventional shooting schedule. But the deeper consequence was aesthetic. Because Roeg was operating the camera, film's gaze carries a unity of intention that is almost unsettling. When the lens lingers on a lizard's eye or tracks a column of ants dismantling a beetle, it does so with the same attentiveness it brings to a close-up of a gutter's face. The hierarchy of importance, humans above nature, story above setting, is deliberately flattened. The desert is not scenery. It is a character with as much narrative weight as any of the three leads. Now here's where it gets complicated. That flattening is both the film's greatest strength and its most provocative challenge, because it means Roeg is asking you to watch a story about human disconnection through a lens that is itself disconnected from human priority. The camera doesn't take sides. It observes a tree with the same patience it observes a death. And that choice, that refusal to editorialize through the lens, is what makes Walkabout feel less like a movie and more like a piece of the earth remembering something. 6. Grind beneath the beauty. The beauty of the finished film obscures what it cost to make. Roeg drove his small team deep into locations that were not merely remote, actively hostile. The shoot stretched across multiple sites in South Australia and the Northern Territory, and continuity between locations was maintained more by instinct than by the kind of meticulous documentation a larger production would have employed. Jenny Agutter has spoken candidly about the physical demands. Long days walking barefoot across terrain that could cut or burn, performing scenes that required her to appear composed and civilized while her body was screaming with fatigue. Lucian John, the young boy who played her brother, actually Roeg's son, Luke Roeg, credited under a pseudonym, was barely 7 years old during the shoot. Managing a child that young in extreme heat in an environment filled with genuine hazards, snakes, spiders, the sheer disorientation of flat, featureless landscape, required a constant vigilance that drained the crew. Principal photography took place over roughly 14 weeks in 1969 and early 1970, with the film's budget kept deliberately lean, a fraction of what a studio production of comparable ambition would have commanded. Roeg operated with the understanding that every dollar not spent on infrastructure was a dollar that could be spent on time. Time to wait for the right light, time to follow an animal's movement, time to let a scene breathe. For Gulpilil, The physical challenges were different. The land was not foreign to him. What was foreign was the apparatus, the camera, the crew, the strange ritual of repetition that filmmaking demands. Performing a hunt for the camera is not the same as performing a hunt for survival or ceremony. The spiritual weight shifts, the context collapses. Gulpilil navigated this with a grace that Roeg found remarkable, but it would be naive to pretend the process carried no friction. Grind, for him, was not physical. It was ontological. He was being asked to translate something sacred into something consumable. The film, to its credit, seems to know this. 7. What most fans miss here is where we get to the details that transform interpretation. These are the micro-choices hidden in plain sight, the ones that most viewers absorb subconsciously without ever articulating what they've felt. The first is Roeg's use of cross-cutting between the outback and urban civilization. Throughout the film, at moments that seem arbitrary on first viewing, Roeg inserts brief, almost subliminal shots of the city. Look at what your hands are doing. The juxtaposition is never commented on. There is no dialogue that explains it. It simply exists in the cut, waiting for you to feel the implication. The second detail is the way Roeg frames the girl's body throughout the film. There are sequences where a gutter is filmed swimming, resting, moving through the landscape in states of undress. Decades of commentary have debated whether these shots are exploitative. Watch the framing closely. In virtually every instance, the camera's relationship to a gutter's body mirrors the way it frames the landscape, with distance, with stillness, with a refusal to aestheticize or leer. Now compare this to the way Gulpilil's character looks at her during the same scenes. His gaze is different. It is curious, warm, unguarded. Roeg is filming two gazes simultaneously, the cameras and the characters, and the tension between them is the tension of the film. The camera knows something the characters don't. It knows that looking is never innocent. Third detail, and the one that changes everything, occurs during the dance sequence near the film's climax. Gulpilil's character performs an elaborate courtship dance for the girl, a display of breathtaking physical virtuosity and emotional vulnerability, and she doesn't understand it. She literally does not comprehend that she is being spoken to. This is not because she is stupid, it is because her entire framework for reading human expression has no category for what she is witnessing. She sees movement, she does not see language. And in that failure of translation, that moment where beauty is offered and cannot be received, Roeg places the entire tragedy of the colonial encounter. It is 4 minutes long, it contains almost no word, and it is one of the most devastating scenes in the history of cinema. But that's only half the story. 8. The fracture line. The conflict at the heart of Walkabout's production and reception was not a conventional studio battle. Roeg had relative creative freedom, and the film was not subjected to the kind of interference that gutted so many ambitious projects of its era. The conflict was cultural, and it played out not on set, but in the critical response. When Walkabout premiered at the 1971 Cannes Film Festival, it was met with admiration, but also with a certain puzzlement. Critics praised the cinematography in terms that sometimes bordered on fetishization. The landscape was stunning, the visuals were gorgeous, the film was a visual poem. What fewer critics engaged with was the argument the visuals were making, the cross-cutting, the flattened hierarchy between human and animal, the deliberate refusal of narrative resolution. These were treated as stylistic eccentricities rather than as the intellectual architecture of the film. And then there was the question that would follow Walkabout for decades. Is this film an act of cultural appropriation? Roeg, a white British director, telling a story that centers an Aboriginal character's spiritual practice, filming sacred adjacent material for a Western audience, using a non-actor from an indigenous community as a vehicle for his artistic vision. These are not trivial concerns. Film's defenders argued, with justification, that Roeg's intention was critique, not celebration of colonialism, that the entire point of the movie is to indict the Western gaze for its inability to see. The film's critics countered, also with justification, that intention does not neutralize impact, and that the machinery of filmmaking itself, the camera, the edit, the distribution to Western audiences, replicates the very power dynamic the film claims to critique. Both sides are right, and that tension, that irresolvable friction, is part of what makes Walkabout an endlessly productive text. It is a film that contains its own critique. It is a mirror that knows it is a mirror, and the discomfort that produces is not a flaw. It is the point. Now here's the part most people miss about this conflict. Roeg seems to have anticipated it. The film's self-reflexive visual strategies, the camera that watches itself watching, the edits that expose the artificiality of juxtaposition, suggest a filmmaker who understood that his position was compromised and chose to make that compromise visible rather than to pretend it didn't exist. Whether that constitutes sufficient ethical reckoning is a question each viewer must answer for themselves. But the awareness is there, woven into the grain of the film, and ignoring it means ignoring half of what Roeg built. 9. The irony no one saw coming. The deepest irony of Walkabout is not a plot twist. It is what happened to its performers after the cameras stopped rolling. Jenny Agutter went on to build a long, respected career. The Railway Children, Logan's Run, An American Werewolf in London, and eventually a beloved presence in British television. She carried Walkabout with her as a credential, a calling card, a proof of early seriousness. The film opened doors for her. It became a chapter in a story of professional ascent. David Gulpilil's trajectory was different. After Walkabout, he became the most internationally recognized Aboriginal actor in Australian history. He appeared in Storm Boy, The Last Wave, Crocodile Dundee, Rabbit Proof Fence, The Tracker, Australia, and Charlie's Country, for which he won Best Actor in the Yoon Certain Regard section at Cannes in 2014. His career, by any external measure, was extraordinary. The cost behind the glow was immense. Gulpilil struggled for decades with the dissonance between his cultural identity and the demands of the film industry. He battled alcoholism, spent time in prison, and experienced periods of homelessness. He spoke in interviews late in his life about feeling caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, serving as a bridge that was used by both sides and maintained by neither. He passed away in November 2021 from lung cancer at the age of 68, and the tributes that followed were suffused with a grief that was partly for the man and partly for the system that consumed his gifts without adequately honoring the soil from which those gifts grew. Here is the irony that cuts to bone. Film's thesis that two ways of seeing the world can come close enough to touch and still fail to understand each other played out in the life of its own star. Gulpilil was seen by millions. He was admired, celebrated, awarded, and he was, in fundamental ways, not understood. The performance that made him famous was a performance of cultural fluency, of spiritual groundedness, of a man entirely at home in his world. The life that followed was a performance of navigating a world that could applaud that groundedness on screen and dismantle it in practice. Walkabout is a tragedy of failed translation, then Gulpilil's life became its most devastating epilogue. A slow fire. Walkabout did not explode into cultural consciousness the way some landmark films do. It did not break box office records. It did not sweep award season. Its initial theatrical run was modest, its audience primarily cinephiles and festival attendees. The world was not ready to sit with a film that moved at the speed of geology and asked questions it refused to answer. And then, slowly, everything changed. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Walkabout began to circulate on television and in repertory screenings, and its reputation grew with each passing year. Cinematographers cited it as foundational. Malick's Badlands and Days of Heaven owe a visible debt to Roeg's integration of natural imagery into narrative storytelling. Weir's Picnic at Hanging Rock, released just 4 years after Walkabout, shares its sense of landscape as a force that swallows human intention. The Australian New Wave, broadly speaking, is unimaginable without the path Roeg cleared. The film's influence extended beyond the Australian context. The technique of cross-cutting between narrative action and seemingly unrelated natural imagery, ants, water, decay, growth, became a recognizable tool in art cinema worldwide. You watch a contemporary film that pauses its story to observe an animal or a weather pattern with the same intensity it brings to a human face, you are watching a descendant of Walkabout. Roeg didn't invent the technique, but he codified its emotional grammar. In 2010, the Criterion Collection released a restored edition of the film, cementing its status in the canon and introducing it to a new generation of viewers. The critical reassessment that accompanied that release was markedly different from the film's initial reception. Where 1971 reviews praised the visuals and puzzled over the structure, 21st century criticism engaged directly with the film's politics of looking, its treatment of indigenous representation, and its prescient environmental consciousness. Walkabout had not changed. The world had finally developed the vocabulary to meet it. 11. The ripple that never stopped. The ripple effects of Walkabout extend into territories that might surprise even dedicated fans of the film. In cinematography, Roeg's decision to shoot the outback with the same visual grammar one might bring to a character study, shallow focus on a blade of grass, tracking shots that follow the path of water through sand, fundamentally expanded what landscape photography could mean in narrative cinema. Before Walkabout, landscapes in film were largely establishing shots or backdrops. After Walkabout, they could be arguments, they could be emotions, they could carry the weight that dialogue refused to. In the discourse around indigenous representation in film, Walkabout occupies a complicated but essential position. It arrived before the frameworks of post-colonial film theory had fully matured, and it both exemplifies and challenges the patterns those frameworks would later describe. The film cannot be cleanly categorized as either progressive or problematic because it is, with unusual self-awareness, both at once. This duality has made it a recurring touchstone in academic discussions about who has the right to tell whose story, and under what conditions representation becomes extraction. The conversation it started has never concluded, and arguably should not. David Gulpilil specifically, Walkabout launched a career that became a template, imperfect, painful, but undeniably pioneering, for indigenous actors navigating the global film industry. Every Aboriginal performer who has followed, from Deborah Mailman to Hamilton Morris, works in a landscape that Gulpilil's visibility helped shape. Doors he opened came at a price, but they opened nonetheless, and the actors who walk through them carry both his achievement and his caution. The film's closing scene, in which the adult girl, now married and living in a sterile urban apartment, remembers or imagines a moment of idyllic freedom at the waterhole with the boy and her brother, has become one of the most analyzed endings in world cinema. It is quoted, referenced, parodied, and debated. Nostalgia? Is it guilt? Is it a fantasy she never actually lived? Leaves the question open, and that openness is precisely why the image endures. It doesn't shout. It lingers. It asks you to sit with the possibility that the most important moment in a person's life might be the one they failed to recognize while it was happening. That idea has threaded its way into films as diverse as The Tree of Life, Beasts of the Southern Wild, and Nomadland. It surfaces whenever a filmmaker trusts that an audience can hold ambiguity without demanding resolution. Walkabout taught cinema that unanswered questions are not weaknesses, they are invitations. 12. Why it still whispers. So what does it mean to watch Walkabout now, more than 50 years after it was made, knowing what we know? It means watching a film that understood, before most of the world was ready to hear it, that the greatest threat to human connection is not distance, but the illusion of comprehension. The girl and the boy are never physically far apart. They share food, they share water, they share silence. And still, when the moment arrives that demands real understanding, when the dance is offered, when the soul is laid bare, the translation fails. Not because of malice, not because of stupidity, because the systems they were raised inside gave them different dictionaries for the same world, and neither system taught them how to say, "I don't understand, but I want to." That is not a lesson about 1971. That is a lesson about now. About every conversation that collapses not because someone shouted, but because someone couldn't hear. About every culture that admires another's beauty from across a screen and calls that admiration understanding. About the distance between seeing and knowing, which is the widest distance there is. Roeg saw this. He built a film that embodies it in every cut, every held frame, every insect given the same visual dignity as a human face. He made a movie that is, at its core, about the tragedy of the gaze. And then he aimed that gaze at an audience and trusted them to feel the indictment. David Gulpilil brought this truth into the film with his body, his movement, his unscripted presence. Egoter carried its opposite, the composed, contained, culturally armored self that cannot break open, even when breaking open is the only thing that could save it. Together, they created something that doesn't age because the human failure it describes doesn't age. Watch Walkabout again. Watch it with the crosscuts in mind. Watch the dance scene and count the seconds the girl's face remains uncomprehending. Watch the way Roeg films water, always moving, always shared, always the one thing both worlds agree is sacred. Watch it with fresh eyes, knowing what it cost, knowing who paid, knowing that the film predicted its own star's life with a clarity that borders on prophecy. If this changed how you see Walkabout, hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people find these deep dives into the films that deserve a second look. And tell me in the comments, which moment in the film hit differently once you understood the hidden layer? I'll see you in the next one.